Yo, what is up everyone? Yoda2003 here, and today I'm gonna go through from start to finish how to perform VHS Generation Loss on a given piece of digital media and share it with the world. Now, before I can do that, you need to know what generation loss is. Generation loss is essentially the loss of data over time by iterating a transformation on that data. Now, for VHS generation loss, this means that we're going to take a given source video, record it onto a VHS tape, and then play back that VHS tape. But there's a catch. Instead of just consuming the resulting video signal with our eyes and brain, we record that signal onto another VHS tape. From there on, it's rinse and repeat ad infinitum. I've published tons of videos on my channel where I use this process to give recordings of me playing retro games that old-timey VHS feel. And now I'm going to pass all of the knowledge I've acquired throughout my experiments down to you. So without further ado, let's do this. First, let's go over exactly what you need for a bare minimum VHS generation loss setup. One monitor or television set with support for analog input, 2 VCRs, 3 male-to-male RCA or coaxial cables depending on what your VCRs support, 2 preferably blank VHS tapes, 1 analog video source, more on that later, and 1 video capture card with support for an analog video source. Now, that last one you'll only need if you want to digitize the tape that you're left with after doing all the generation loss. I personally use an Elgato Game Capture HD game DVR device, and I really do recommend it if you haven't already invested in an HDMI plus analog compatible capture card. One thing to take note of though is that I actually had to buy a separate composite to HDMI converter because the built-in analog support on my capture card is just a little too sensitive when it comes to the distorted signals that VCRs can produce. The next thing to consider is your actual source material. Based on my personal experience with generation loss on VHS, there are a few characteristics of the source material that are extremely important to consider. Number 1, brightness. The overall brightness of your video plays a big role in how it's affected by the generation loss process. Videos with higher overall brightness have lots of lighter colors like white, yellow, magenta, and so on. These videos will degrade faster with each generation and are more likely to suffer from tracking errors, distortion, and dropouts. Videos with lower overall brightness are pretty much the opposite, containing more dark colors such as brown, gray, and black. These videos will take many more generations to degrade the same amount as their brighter counterparts and ultimately yield more subtle results as far as color degradation and overall image loss with each generation. Number 2, color. How colorful your video is also plays an important role in how your results will look. Videos with lots of bright and saturated colors will result in lots of color degradation, directional blur, and overall image loss. The hues present in your video should also be considered. Reddish colors tend to degrade into more pink and magenta tones, and greenish blue colors tend more towards aquamarine. On the flip side, darker and less saturated colors will yield less extreme results with each generation, and ultimately make any noise that accumulates more noticeable. Number 3, length. This last one is simple. The length of your video is directly proportional to how long you'll actually spend recording each generation. This one mostly depends on how long you're willing to sit there monitoring each generation, and how many generations you ultimately plan on doing. As you acquire more experience with generation loss, you'll get a feel for how many generations it takes for your specific hardware to achieve the desired effect, and how much time you're willing to, or are able to, invest in it. I usually keep my sources under 20 minutes because my specific setup yields satisfactory results after around 4 generations, meaning I only end up spending up to an hour and a half between starting the process and digitizing the results. Whatever source you use is ultimately your choice. It all depends on the effect you're going after and what your preferences are. With that out of the way, let's move on to getting everything set up. First things first, gather materials. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to lay out all the components of the setup so that all of the cable connections are clearly visible. Of course, you'll have to adapt according to where it's most convenient for you to place everything. Now, pay attention to that DVD player I have over there. Remember the analog video source I mentioned earlier? Well, that's it right there. but just because I use a DVD player doesn't mean you have to as well. What I mean by analog video source is basically anything that you can plug into your VCR, including game consoles, DVRs, heck, even an old cable box or antenna will do the trick. The only reason I use this DVD player in my setup is because it has the ability to play digital video files exported from my computer on a USB flash drive. So again, it all depends on what exactly you want to be able to do, but considering the fact that most videos these days are digital, you'll probably want something that can convert digital video to an analog signal. Next, take your two VCRs and take a good look at those ports. Hey baby, those are some fine ports you got there. Ooh, are those dual inputs I see? In all seriousness though, you'll want to check out the ports on both VCRs to see which ones are for input and which ones are for output. Next, you'll want to decide which of these VCRs is going to be your recording deck. Basically, this will be the VCR you use to record the output of the other VCR onto the tapes. For the longest time I used this newer VCR here to record each generation, but there was a problem where with each generation the image would get brighter and brighter, until the tracking on the older VCR just completely crapped out, meaning I was pretty limited as far as how many generations I could actually do. Long story short, now I use the older VCR to record everything, which seems to have solved the problem. So, you might have to try it both ways to see which results you like the best. Now that we have that out of the way, let's plug some cables in. Take one of your cables and plug it into the input jack of your recording VCR. Then, plug the other end into the output jack of the other VCR. Next, take another cable and plug one end into the output jack of your recording VCR, and plug the other end into any of the available compatible inputs on your TV or monitor. Note that if your TV or monitor doesn't have any compatible analog inputs, you'll either have to hunt one down that does, or bite the bullet and buy an analog to digital converter. Afterwards, take the remaining cable and plug one end into the output jack of your analog video source. Then, take the other end and plug that into the input jack of your non-recording or playback VCR. Note, there's a few asterisks here. If your video source comes with a male connector like the Super Nintendo, you won't need a third cable and will instead want to plug that connector directly into the VCR's input jack. Also, if your recording VCR has support for multiple inputs, it might be more convenient to plug the analog video source into one of those rather than the input on the second VCR. Also, make sure your devices all have power. Best thing to do is to use one of these surge protector power strips and plug that into the nearest / most convenient outlet. Afterwards, plug all that shiz in and you're ready to go. Finally, we can move on to the moment we've all been waiting for. It's time for some generation loss. Alright, so first things first. Make sure you have both of your VHS tapes at an arm's length and ready to go. Next, take either one and insert it into your recording VCR that you decided on earlier. After that, make sure your analog video source is ready to be recorded. Right here I'm powering on my DVD player and making sure that when I press the play button, the correct video will start immediately. Next, simply hit record on your recording VCR, then quickly get your analog video source started. Now, simply just wait for the video to be recorded onto the tape. Once it's done, hit stop on the recording VCR. Congratulations! You've just recorded what's referred to as the first generation, or simply Generation 1. Once you're done celebrating this amazing feat, rewind the tape back to where your recording starts. It might be helpful to find the manual for both of your VCRs and look up how to use the memory function, so that even if the beginning of your recording isn't at the beginning of the tape, you can still rewind it back to the correct spot without having to seek the whole time. Trust me, it'll save you your precious time and machinery. But if you want to keep things simple, just make sure that both tapes are fully rewound before you make any recordings. Next, pop that tape out of the recording VCR and insert it into the playback VCR. Afterwards, insert the other blank tape into the recording VCR. Make sure the blank is rewound. Also, if your recording VCR has multiple inputs, be sure to switch the input so that you can see the output from your playback VCR. A quick way to check this is to briefly start playing back the tape to see if you get a signal. Then, if all is well and good, hit record on your recording VCR and hit play on your playback VCR. Those names make a lot more sense now, don't they? Now, simply let the tape play, and once it's done, hit stop again on the recording VCR. Frickin' epic, man. You've just recorded your second generation. Make sure you rewind both tapes to where their respective recordings start. Then, eject both tapes from their respective VCRs and swap them, inserting the tape that used to be in the recording VCR into the playback VCR, and vice versa. Next, hit record on the recording VCR and play on the playback VCR once again for a third generation. Once that's done cooking, stop the recording, swap the tapes, start the recording, and repeat to your liking. The most fun part of this process is seeing how everything degrades over time, so don't be afraid to go one generation more than you think you should, because the previous generation is always available to you so long as you don't overwrite it with the next. Again, I usually perform 4 generations for the videos on my channel, but there's been a couple times where I went the extra mile and did a few more, just for the heck of it. Experimentation is key here, and in the end it all depends on your hardware's capabilities as well as your personal taste. And with that, we conclude this VHS Generation Loss tutorial. I won't go into too much detail on how to actually digitize the tape for editing and uploading, as it really depends on what hardware you're using to do so. There's plenty of videos on YouTube about that kind of thing, and it's ultimately beyond the scope of this tutorial. Thank you very much to all those who watched this tutorial all the way through, and I sincerely hope that I have done the topic justice. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. If you have any questions related to the material I've covered in this tutorial, just leave a comment. I promise that I'll answer as soon as I can. However, if you have any questions about purchasing any of the materials I've talked about, please refer to Google. Now, let's take a moment to enjoy the fruits of our labor. See you guys later.